For a religious or spiritual movement to begin, there has to be first three separate generations. There has to be the generation before the religious or spiritual event happened. There has to be the generation during which the spiritual or religious event happened. And then there has to be the generation that comes after the spiritual or the religious event happened. And those three parts are very critical in understanding the point I'm going to make about the Mandela Effect. Because why I think the Mandela Effect has a lot of hallmarks of a religious experience, a spiritual experience, and indeed really the hallmarks of a religion in itself is because it has some of the critical things that need to happen in order for a real religion to be birthed. The major thing that I can think of is the middle generation, which is what we are, the generation that is experiencing the Mandela Effect. We are going through something right now that a lot of generations went through when their religions were being born. I've said it time and again, I don't particularly have any kind of angst for any other religion, and I'm only going to use Christianity as an example for this, not because I have some sort of underpinning like hate or any kind of angst towards Christianity. It's just that I know it's something that most everyone listening to my voice is most familiar with. So I'm sure this will apply to just about any other religion as well, but it's also one that I'm most comfortable with and one that surrounds me in my everyday life as a Westerner, particularly as an American Westerner. But I know that one of the hallmarks of early Christianity and of the Mandela Effect is that it was a very small but vocal minority that was experiencing something that was very supernatural and that few other people could see. I also know that there was a lot of ridicule, there was a lot of admonishment, and there was a lot of, in some cases, threats that were involved. And certainly nowadays, most of this is over the internet or over places like YouTube, like here, but certainly it's still, a threat is still a threat. And one of the big things that matter about the middle generation is that it's a reworking or a re-understanding of how the world around them works. With the Mandela Effect, we now understand that the past is not settled. So those of us that consider ourselves dedicated MEs, we understand that why it's so upsetting and why it's so difficult to deal with sometimes is that, one, it invades our personal life in a way that we had no choice in dealing with. And oftentimes, a lot of religious figures in the past, they were reluctantly dragged into what became whatever particular religion of that time. Also, too, you have to be called. You know, a lot of MEs say you have to be woken up to see it, because oftentimes you'll hear MEs talk about their significant others or family members or whomever, co-workers, and you'll point out things to them that changed in the past, and they just don't see it, or they shrug it off, or it doesn't bother them, but it sticks with you. That is very much something that is something personal to you, and because it's something that is to you, that you know and you understand in your bones, in your heart, and in your soul, that the world now has fundamentally changed, or you've woken up to a new way, a new understanding in the way the world has always worked, or the world has changed and we're the only ones that can see it. Either way, we've all described this as something that's spiritual. Now, when I say spiritual, that doesn't always mean it's something pleasant. Just because something is spiritual, it doesn't mean that it has to be something that is pleasant. There are plenty of people who have spiritual experiences that are horrific, that are terrifying, and that are awful. And oftentimes, there's a duality to those experiences. There's a duality to those understanding for that particular generation. Another thing, too, is the generation before the religion is birthed, or the spiritual movement is birthed. There's no way that they would be able to foresee or even understand what the middle generation is talking about, because they wouldn't have any inkling or any understanding of what we're talking about and how we're doing it. Like I've always commented about being an ME, what makes it so special and why it can only happen right now is because only right now do we have the technology for us to communicate with one another. They didn't have that kind of technology 20 years ago, 200 years ago. Really, honestly, even 10 years ago, not in the form that we have it now and in the way in which it's distributed now. So there's this real paradigm shift that has to happen. And that, too, also plays into, with this new way in which we see the world with technology and our new understanding as MEs, this also plays into another point. Religions are always birthed in a time of social and spiritual upheaval, and you know it in your gut. You can feel it, whether you're a believer in the Mandela Effect or not, and if you've even gotten this far in this video and you understand that there's something going on, something underneath, something unseen, something spiritual is happening, and it's changing. It's changing everything. Even if you're not an ME, you can feel it. And all of that very much matters. That upheaval and that chaos, it matters very, very much. Another thing that matters is during this upheaval and this chaos, we talk about the Mandela effects themselves. There's always an unexplained series of events involved that only a small subset of the population can see, and they understand those changes have fundamentally changed the way in which reality works. And because you're an ME and you understand, fundamentally, you now know in your heart, truly, reality is not what the former generation or those that are in our generation that are unbelievers. You understand that something is now different with the reality that we all are experiencing. All of those things tie very well to Christianity. It ties very well to all kinds of other religions as well. Now, the big thing and the major thing that where we break from the Abrahamic religions, particularly things like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, is that they are based in a linear time construct, and they are based on the idea of a sequence of events that need to happen in order for that linear time to make sense. There has to be a buildup of things. For Christians, it's the second coming. For Judaism, it's the first. For Islam, I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure they have a version of Armageddon, but ultimately it all ends with the Abrahamic religions with a buildup, and there has to be a linear understanding of time in order for those religions to make sense. This is where the Mandela Effect, it breaks from that. And that's where it also gets a lot of friction from people who are believers in the Abrahamic religions that also see the Mandela Effect. There's a lot of grief there, a lot of frustration, a lot of fear, because they know spiritually there's a conflict there. And that sort of gets into the third generation of any religion, and that is the generation that didn't experience firsthand what that middle generation, what we're experiencing. You see, in most religions that are established, they're already in that third generation, where they hear secondhand what happened. There's no one alive today that we know of that's a normal human being that experienced anything that happened during the time of the New Testament. It's all based on faith. It's all based on you reading the text and having a series of scholars and pastors and preachers and rabbis and the like explaining to you that generation at the time what was actually happening and how it is to be interpreted. Now, for MEs, this is something we can't imagine, because to be an ME, you already know that the idea of the past is malleable and it's changeable. So, not only are you different than the Abrahamic religions because you don't believe in a linear concept of time, because you believe that changes can happen in the past, so therefore linear time becomes more and more obsolete with each passing ME. So it's very hard to predict, once we're gone and we leave this mortal coil, what will be left if the MEs stop right now. And there's only our testimony. Will our testimony and our recordings, will they move on and people study them? Will there be a belief system built around what happened in these extraordinary moments in our generation? I don't know. But I do know that those that believe in Abrahamic religions, that's where, particularly when you see like the Bible changes, that conflict is saying that what you're experiencing is in direct conflict with what your religion is telling you, that there has to be a series of events that have to build up. And once, the way even time, we just call it time now. Once time is settled and it becomes in the past, it's not movable and it's over with. And because the past is what helps determine the course of the future, all of that is disrupted if you're an ME, because you don't believe that now, because the past can change, and therefore the present itself becomes something entirely different. And the past is no longer relegated to something that is subservient to the present, and that is at the whim of the present. You know, they talk about something about the victors always writing the past. That's not always the case in the Mandela Effect. If the past itself has been empowered and can itself change when it wants to, just as much as the present. Now, that isn't the case whenever you believe in an Abrahamic religion or a linear concept of time. The past is subservient. The past is only a ledger, because there's a certain number of infractions that will happen before a particular deity has had enough and comes back to do whatever that particular religion says needs to happen. It's a ledger. The past is only a ledger. And there's a certain amount of sin or a certain amount of infractions. There's a number. It's a number. And there's a chart system that will determine when that number is reached. And once that number is reached, then whatever it may be you believe in, the Armageddon, rapture, then those events can happen. And indeed, there's many different sects of those Abrahamic religions that actively work towards manipulating that ledger in order to make those things happen. On all forms, on all sides of the Abrahamic religions. But the Mandela Effect, it changes and it upends all of those things. Because whenever you believe in a linear concept of time, you're ultimately always waiting for something to happen. You're looking forward. You're always seeing. The Mandela Effect, it's the bizarre opposite. We're always looking backwards now. We're seeing what's going to change in the past. It's an absolute break and an absolute change. And then you go to your Bibles, for example, and you're looking for your Bible for something now totally different than what you did in the past. In the past, pre-ME, the Bible was looked at as as many things, like a moral compass and how to settle disputes, whether they're internally or between you and a friend or whatever it may be. Now it's looked to see what's changed and how you can derive meaning from that change. So even now, those tomes, those religious tomes are still important, but they're looked at differently, such as the changes with the Lion and the Lamb, as well as some of the other changes that we've talked about with the Council of Gods, and some of the other changes that have changed for us. And because of that, because the Mandela Effect is obsessed with the present and the past, for me it makes me speculate about what it is and what it means. What does it mean to be an ME? And what does life itself mean? If life isn't moving forward, but instead it's moving in a direction that I have yet to understand, because we haven't had it long enough to build that vocabulary, that empire of vocabulary I talk about, that a lot of Abrahamic religions have had thousands of years to build on and to understand and to interpret. We have none of those because we're that generation first experiencing it. We're the ones that are first communicating it. We're in it right now. Sides are being drawn, just like during those other times and those other religions when sides were being drawn. And there'll be winners and losers of this thing. And I don't know what that means for me, and I don't know what it means for you. But when I first started this series, the We Died in 2012 series, I guess I knew somewhere deep in the substrata, but I hadn't fully articulated the things that I've just expressed to you yet. But the idea of already being in the afterlife, at that time I didn't mean as a literal thing. And now I'm not taking it as something that's literal, but I want to use it as an instrument for you to understand that accepting the way in which things were given to you secondhand, being an ME no longer has to be your default setting. Being an ME, understanding the Mandela Effect is real, is a gift to where, or you can look at it as a gift if you want, to where you can rethink what you think about what this thing is you're experiencing. Are you in life? Are you in the afterlife? Are you in something entirely different? What is this thing? Just like the linear concept of time that was handed down to you. That linear concept of time was needed in order for Abrahamic religions, and indeed most religions, to even make sense. None of them would make sense unless there's a linear progression of time. And the Mandela Effect turns that upside down. And if that's the case, then everything about what you experience has to be re-examined. And the sequence from which you exist also too has to be re-examined. And it's provocative to talk about the afterlife and to be active in the afterlife and to do mundane things in the afterlife. But the stages from which you have entered this existence with the rest of us is based on a linear time concept in a Western Abrahamic religion that tells you that there's birth, there's life, and there's death. What if it's not in that order anymore? What if it's in some other order that we haven't even begun to understand? And I want to put that out there so we can begin to understand and look around for ourselves and ask, what is this thing that we're all experiencing? And why is the past changing? And why? And it's always the small mundane things like Ed McMahon handing out those checks, or Gary Oldman being Gary Oldman instead of Gary Oldham, or anything else that might rattle you. Mirror, mirror on the wall. There's biblical changes now. There's a council of Elohim, of which it seems is Yahweh a part of? Or how do you read that? And then that other Bible verse saying God is both the creator of good and of evil. So, I don't know, and I don't know where I stand and what all this means. But I definitely think that the Mandela Effect is getting to the point to where it's reaching those critical components that make itself something that is more than just a fad or a bit of YouTube strangeness. That this is a legitimate spiritual exercise and is a legitimate spiritual movement. And I think that even if this ends today, all of our testimonies mattered. And for those into the quote future that are listening to this, understand we all experienced these things. These things were real that we saw and we felt. Trees moved around me. Buildings changed. The earth isn't what we're taught what it is, this realm we're in. Okay, that's all I have for now. Thank you very much for listening.